Hey, good morning, good afternoon to all of you. I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today at the Institute for Safe Medication Practices for our webinar program entitled Human Factors, Role and Considerations in Drug Labeling and Packaging. My name is Matt Grissinger. I'm the Director of Education at ISMP, and I'll be your host and the first speaker for today's program. Human error can be described as a failure of a common sequence of psychological functions that are basic to human behavior. This failure involves perception of the situation, the way these stimuli are interpreted, and the execution of planned actions. Human factors in healthcare considers the way in which professionals interact with the medications and medication technologies within their environment, and how this cognition can influence human behavior, at times leading to human error. The ability to correctly interpret a medication label can be a contributing factor to medication-related events, possibly even leading to harmful patient outcomes. Understanding how limitations of human performance in combination with error-prone label designs contribute to these events is vital to providing support to individuals working in a complex medication systems. Using an adverse event case example, this program will describe the differences between active and latent failures, compare at-risk behaviors and human error displayed during an actual event, and describe performance-shaping factors known to influence safe behaviors with medication use. Faculty from the FDA's Division of Medication Error Prevention Analysis, or DMEPA, will describe their work in enhancing human performance and the prevention of medication errors using specialized pre-market and post-market activities addressing human factor vulnerabilities. Actions taken to address recent medication error reports will be explored, as well as the role of healthcare practitioners in identifying, preventing, and mitigating medication errors. We also want to thank Novartis, specifically the Name Creation and Regulatory Strategy Group, for the generous support of this program. Some quick housekeeping items. This program is being recorded and will be available on the ISMP website. Handouts for today's program can be found using the link provided in the reminder email you received earlier today, as well as in the Zoom chat box that Jordan will post shortly. And she just posted it right now. All attendees are in listen mode only during the presentation. Feel free to ask a question by accessing the Q&A function on your toolbar to the left of the chat box. We will have time at the end for a Q&A. Next slide, Jordan. You see on this slide, everyone, just the disclosures regarding faculty in our CE provider Pro CE. And it states that neither myself, Ms. Shelley, or Pro CE staff have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. Next slide. And also you'll see, without reading this, everyone, you see disclosure of unlabeled use and other disclaimers. These will be on your slides. And if you want to read these in full, you can read them after you download them after the program. Regarding CME activity information, today's program is accredited for one ACPE contact hour following the completion of the post-program evaluation by October 27th. You'll see on the slide the steps in the process for obtaining the CE, again by logging into proce.com. You'll see the link in the slides, and again, once you download these slides, you will get that link, and also, more importantly, you will need to have the attendance code, and that code will be provided at the end of today's activity. Next slide, Renee. Also, we got some. This activity has been approved for up to one California State Nursing contact hour by the provider Deborah Simmons, who is approved by the California Board of Registered Nursing. Next slide, Renee. So let's talk about today's content. So here are the objectives for today's program. First, I'm going to begin and talk about and help you differentiate between human errors and at-risk behaviors. We'll talk about factors that can degrade human performance and lead to human error. We'll also identify examples of unsafe drug product labeling and packaging, as well as have a description of the FDA's role in pre-marketing and post-marketing activities to prevent and address medication errors. Next slide. So let me introduce the speakers. I already introduced myself, and again, I'm Matt Grissinger. I'm the Director of Education at the Institute for Safe Medication Practices. Pharmacist by background, and I've been at ISMP since 2000. Ms. Shelley Mystery received her Doctor of Pharmacy from Northeastern University in 2011 and a Master's in Public Health from the University of Maryland School of Medicine in 2012. Michele joined DMEPA at the FDA in 2014. She currently serves as an Associate Director for Nomenclature and Labeling within DMEPA, where she currently oversees safety recommendations regarding drug nomenclature, labels, labeling, packaging, and product design. Prior to joining the FDA and DMEPA in 2014, she was a fellow with the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Health, working on adverse drug event prevention. So on that note, let's go to the next slide and begin the program. So I'm going to start this program off and take about 20 minutes of time to kind of give you a little background about medication errors and have some sort of segue into Michele's portion of the presentation. So the first thing we have to understand, broadly speaking, is when it comes to medication errors, they're never or rarely caused by a single thing going wrong or the act or of a single practitioner. And often for any medication error to occur and reach the patient and maybe even lead to a catastrophic event, it's usually the result of combined effects of many latent failures, which we'll define in the next slide, in your medication system, as well as, and in addition to, active failures by individuals involved in a scenario. Next slide, please. So let's talk about latent failures first. We call this the blunt end of the medication use process, or blunt end errors. And you see in the description on the slide here, these are breakdowns in your medication use system. Or think about this, think about all the processes of medication use in your organization, from getting a patient list, doctors ordering drugs, pharmacists reviewing and dispensing orders, nurses obtaining, administering, and monitoring effects of drugs. Think of all the processes that take place. And latent failures are breakdowns in the setup or design of those processes. So you see in that second bullet, we have here, it often originates with organization policies, your procedures, your practices, your processes, the amount of resources you have. And these are the type of things that we say in the first bullet, they lie dormant. And realistically, they're always there. It's just that oftentimes things don't go wrong because of them until something bad happens and all of a sudden becomes clear we've had many contributing factors from our organization in this event. Next slide, please. So let's use some examples of latent failures. We'll refer to a recent case that was in the media the past year, where a nurse accidentally gave a patient a neuromuscular blocking agent, vecuronium, that resulted in their death. But there were many, based on investigations at the organization, many latent failures or contributing factors that are a result of unsafe practices allowed by the organization. So for example, you see that first bullet, it started off with many practitioners, prescribers around the country still use brand names of medications that no longer exist. Like in this case, Versed, or think of drugs like Ativan and Xanax. They're easier names to say and spell compared to the generic names. So an order was given for Versed, not the thing that was available, which is only midazolam. So while searching for this drug in an automated dispensing cabinet, this nurse was able to type in only two letters, the letters VE. And what happened was only one drug name came up. So this nurse chose that drug and went on and moved on. And unfortunately, that drug was vecuronium, not Versed. And if you think about the scenario, everyone, if they had typed in, they had to have typed in three letters like VER, this would have happened. So the fact that we can search drug names with minimal letters, and that's a result of, again, the design of both of the technologies being used, as well as the use of brand names that aren't used anymore. In addition, another latent failure involved in the case is the fact that anybody in this organization, not just in the situation, had the ability to remove a medication on override. And that can mean two different things you see on the slide, either removing medication before a pharmacist reviewed the order and quote unquote release the drug, or at times maybe even remove a medication without an order. You think about it, in this case, this patient never had an order for the drug that the nurse obtained. So, but it was the organization's decision to allow any practitioner to remove a high alert medication like a neuromuscular blocking agent on override, essentially stating anyone can remove a paralyzing agent without an order. So let's go to the next slide. Now let's go contrast that to active failures, or what we call the sharp end. Now these are things all of us on this screen, on this call today, experience, right? Those are those mistakes that we make in day-to-day life. You'll see down further in the slide, slips, lapses, misreading things. How many of us on this program have grabbed the wrong drug off the shelf, have misread a drug in an order, have pulled the wrong thing off the shelf at a supermarket? These type of things involve also confirmation bias, where the minute your mind made a decision that you grabbed the right thing, our mind's locked down, and we often don't catch the very things we grabbed that were wrong. We don't catch ourselves often because our mind made the assumption we had the right thing. The second thing, though, in the book we have to discuss are just sometimes the mistakes, which are planning failures or decisions that we make. So human beings can either just slip, misread things, have a lapse, or we can make a decision, and sometimes the decisions are the best in the world, right? So, and we'll talk about this in a couple more slides. The type of decision that we made and the reason we made the decision often come to play into harmful events as well. Next slide, please. So in this case, an example of an active failure in this case, and the human error part of it. Well, this nurse grabbed a paralyzing agent, neuromuscular blocker, and there are warnings on the vial that it is a paralyzing agent on the cap and on the vial itself. But those warnings were not seen by the nurse, right? So think about, again, the times as well as you have grabbed things and just didn't see things on the label. Classic example of that. So she thought she was removing Versed or midazolam, not like running the whole time. And you think about this, the minute that drug name appeared on the screen, she accepted that drug, her mind made the conclusion that we're done. We got Versed, and never saw other things on the label to maybe dissuade them from seeing the right thing up front. And listen, in this case too, the behavioral choice is the use of overrides, right? This nurse know they need to get this drug, used an override to get the drug. So that was behavioral choice, but anybody in that organization, and it's not just this organization. Those like the failures we listed in a couple of slides happen in many organizations in this country, whereby, again, we set people up to fail by allowing a drug on override. Therefore, anyone knows they can remove a drug on override. Therefore, they make that behavioral choice to use the override. So this is a classic example we'll come back to later, where organizations almost encourage the use of, encourage poor behavioral choices. Next slide, please. So why are these two things important? Well, it's important to understand these two broad tenets of why errors occur, because that will dictate how you respond to the person involved in the case to begin with, right? So and that includes both the active and latent failures involved in this case. And really, that's a reflection of the culture where you work. Right now, where you work, what happens when you make a human error? Are you punished for that? Are you chastised for that? Are you told, well, next time read the label 3 times, or told that maybe you should follow the 5 rights? If you hear any remark like that, that's a poor reflection of your culture and a lack of understanding of why errors happen, especially human errors. And we'll go into more detail about that as well in a couple of slides. So let's move to the next slide, slide 15. There's 3 fundamental beliefs in what we call a just culture. And for everyone listening in, these are things that we all have to leave here understanding when we leave. Number 1, to err is human. Everyone makes mistakes on this call. Everyone has misread something, has grabbed the wrong drug, etc., misread something in a paper or on a pharmacy label. Number 2, to drift is human, right? We all of us make unsafe behavioral choices on this call. Whether you admit to it or not, many of us, a great example is texting while you're driving, going over a speed limit by 15 miles per hour, are examples of behavioral choices you made, and that's what we call drifting. And lastly, risk is everywhere, especially medication use. Isn't just getting medication in itself risky. let alone the processes of ordering medication and making it and dispensing and storing and giving it. There's risk everywhere in healthcare. And we have to, and so it's, but risk isn't necessarily bad, but how do we deal with that risk is the biggest question. Next slide. So there's three types of human behaviors we alluded to already. I'm going to come back to them again, but explain them in a little different order. So number one is human error up front, and we'll come back to that. But the key phrase, everyone, in the gray box is the yellow word inadvertent action. Nobody intentionally decides to read the wrong thing on a label. So therefore, how you respond to a practitioner involved in a human error, it should be different compared to number two, at-risk behaviors. Now, that is a behavior of choice. That's something that you chose to do, but often you didn't know there was risk involved or nothing ever went wrong when you took that shortcut or workaround or poor choice. So the key thing in the second item is, there's not an intent to cause harm, to be reckless, etc. That's a very key differentiator from the third item, reckless behavior. Also behavior of choice, but in that situation, there is some intent to really disregard that risk. You know about the risk, you're choosing to ignore it anyway and take that action. Next slide. So I'm going to start with the drift first, and at-risk behaviors, go to human errors, which will segue to Michelle's presentation of human factors. So again, to drift is human. We all choose at times to do things that are risky, but don't see the risk. And think about why you do that. Think about things that work, shortcuts you've taken, workarounds, didn't feel like using a barcode scanner at work. Why did you take those shortcuts? Right? Usually it's the desire to get more done, especially in today's age at post-COVID and all the issues we have with staffing. That probably even makes this even more prevalent. And the key thing is defeating perception of risk. You see that picture on the left? That's a great old picture of Steve Irwin back in the early 2000s. And you can search this on the internet, by the way, the interview after this photo was taken. Now, in the chat box, you're going to tell me, what do you guys, everyone think? Is this what Steve's, let me see what Steve's doing. He has this baby boy in his left hand while he's feeding, I assume that's an alligator with some raw meat in his right hand. Do you think that's a human error? Is that at-risk behavior, or is that reckless behavior? Now I'll let you put some responses in the chat box. And in the meantime, let's talk about the right-hand picture, because listen, there's risk everywhere in healthcare. Do you think there's any, that's probably simulations you're seeing there as an example, but look at all the devices, the technology, the people, all things involved here that involve risk in healthcare. And to see the response to Steve Irwin's situation, Steve in this situation who was really an at-risk behavior, even though many of you are thinking, man, that's insane, that was a reckless behavior. But when you ask Steve and you read the mark to the effect of, what are you talking about? I'm a professional. I've had alligators thousands of times. I never intended to put my boy at risk when I did this. So that's what makes a difference, everyone. And I kind of gave you a trick question. It's not what you think it was. It's you have to interview that person, see what their intent was regarding their actions. His action was not to harm his son. Believe me, none of us on this call would do that, right? But in his mind, it was not a big deal because he was a quote professional. Next slide, please. So here's one example. Nurse needs to give a drug to a baby in a neonatal ICU or NICU. This ICU has an automated dispensing cabinet you see in the picture to the right. After accessing the baby's record and selecting the correct medication, the ADC opens the drawer with 4 bins. As this nurse always has done, the nurse reaches into the second bin where the vial medication has always been, sees the blue cap on the vial, grabs it, and takes it to the bedside and gives the medication. Yet that was the wrong medication. Now, that was a behavior, right? Some confirmation bias because they saw the blue cap on the vial, thought, oh, this is my drug. And the at-risk behavior of maybe not following through and even quote unquote reading the label because the right drug has always been in the right spot all the time. And all of a sudden, this phone have done is grab things off the shelf because we knew it was there the whole time. That was my behavioral choice to do that, right? But well, A, it was not intent to cause harm, but also a pretty common thing in healthcare. Next slide, please. So for at-risk behaviors, again, keep in mind, this is something all of us choose on this phone. And this involves leaders and managers, by the way. This is not just a front-end staff issue as well. So keep in mind, people are losing their situational awareness. They don't see the risk. They don't see what's risky about what they've done. In fact, I'll bet anybody that you've done many at-risk behaviors and have gotten away with it because nothing bad's ever happened. Think about texting and driving. You just haven't gotten in an accident yet. Then when you get into an accident, does your perception change about that, the risk? It's because we've gotten away with it. Next slide, please. But the other thing to keep in mind, especially for the leaders on the call, is often these at-risk behaviors or behavior choices are the result of the organization who rewards people for taking shortcuts. So think about this. If you, wherever you're working, would you prefer a pharmacist who can verify way more orders than anyone else? Pharmacist A can verify 100 per hour, pharmacist B can verify 50 per hour. Or a nurse who can handle giving meds out to 10 patients, compared to a nurse can maybe only handle 6 to 7 patients at a time. Who do you prefer and who would you reward? And listen, the correct answer is the person who works fastest, right? Get more done with less people and less time. Here's the problem. I didn't tell you that the people, the speedy people, are also taking shortcuts. But yet you're rewarding that because you think, oh my God, this person's the great best pharmacist ever. He can verify he can verify 100 orders an hour. He's blowing off all the alerts, including the hard stops and putting nonsense comments in the alerts and just moving on, but he's got 100 orders verified. So that's a classic example of organizations contributing to our behavioral choices. Yeah, often the rules are generally weak. And in the last bullet, successful violations result in rewards. I got my work done. My supervisor thinks I'm great because I'm the fastest guy here in the unit. Next slide, please. So the next two slides are just examples of at-risk behaviors. Anytime we do a workaround or don't use a barcode scanner as an example of that, or use the use of an override, keep in mind though, everyone, there are some of the latent failures lead to these behavioral choices, right? From staffing issues to allowing use of overrides are two examples of that. Rushed communication between shifts at a community pharmacy between the first and second shift of pharmacists or on the nursing unit. Carrying medications often unlabeled in your pockets. Physicians unnecessarily using verbal orders when they can just enter the order themselves. Using a pre-filled syringe as a vial, grabbing and going without really seeing the label. Next slide, please. Borrowing medications. Instead of waiting for the medication to be delivered, we're going to borrow one because it's sitting here right now, even though it's not labeled for a patient. Processing illegible orders without calling a prescriber to verify them, using barcode bracelets, et cetera, posted on the wall, et cetera, not labeling syringes. These are all examples of common at-risk behaviors, poor behavior choices done in organization. How many times are how many times are we rewarded for taking these shortcuts? Next slide, please. So therefore, someone who engages in this type of activity, number one, let's go to the second bullet. First, you got to figure out, well, what's leading to these behaviors? Number one says you need to coach that person to make sure they understand the risk that they took. That, listen, this was an unsafe action that you did, and here's what could go wrong if you do that. So please try to adhere to following this process as an example. But here's the bigger problem for the managers and leaders on the phone. What happens if half the nurses on a unit are doing this at-risk behavior? Half the pharmacy techs in a pharmacy are doing this behavior. You can sit there and coach all those technicians all you want. There's clearly a system problem that's letting people do these workarounds or at-risk behaviors. And it's probably tacitly accepted by leadership. So more importantly, coaching individuals involved so they are aware of the risk, but more importantly, what's stopping people from being compliant? And are you asking this question before an error happens or after an error happens? It's better to identify it beforehand. Next slide, please. Then lastly, human errors, right? And keep in mind, human error is about inadvertency. So it does no one any good to punish people involved in a simple, unintentional, inadvertent human error. Next slide. Therefore, to manage that, at the bottom, well, how we respond to the person is we're going to console them. The person needs to be forgiven. There's no intent. Think about the case I talked about earlier. Did that person intend to not read the vial or see what was on the vial and see the warnings on the vial? That was a human error. That was not a choice. So punishing a person involved, regardless of outcome, doesn't get you anywhere in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't prevent the next error at all. But also, did the system contribute to this? How did your medication use process also contribute to human error? So next slide, please. And there's many things that contribute to human performance. So think about the lighting, the staffing, the climate, any other physical distractions and interruptions that occur, and plus mental distractions by this person involved as well. All these parts of the system contribute to errors or contribute to human error as well. In my last slide, let's use this quick scenario before I give it to Michelle. Look at this example on the left, where years ago, some hospital patients were potentially exposed to HIV because they were reusing insulin pens. But look at the scenarios on the right side of the screen. The human error perspective, someone just accidentally picked up a pen intended for patient A, gave it to patient B. Total inadvertent, not intentional, that was a human error. Compared to number two, pens were being reused intentionally, but the staff didn't know. No one ever taught the staff the harm of sharing insulin pens. The organization didn't routinely label all the insulin pens. So there may be some poor behavioral choices here, but no intent to cause harm or have something that could cause harm. Compared to reckless behavior, where we have, say, a clinic physician intentionally tells staff to reuse the pens. They know about the guidances from OSHA and CDC, but to save money, we're not going to listen to that. We're going to have staff reuse pens. There was intent there, knowing that the harm could result. That makes it reckless behavior. So let's go to the next slide, please. And I think we're going to pass this off to Michelle. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. As Matt had said previously, my name is Michelle Mystery. I am the Associate Director for Nomenclature and Labeling within the Division of Medication Error Prevention and Analysis 1, or DMEPA 1. Next slide, please. This is our official FDA disclaimer, which I'm not going to read out loud. Next slide, please. So historically, some design issues with drug products were not identified and remedied until after the product is already approved and marketed. And in some cases, these issues were only resolved after medication errors had reached and harmed the patient. And this was a very reactive approach to addressing medication errors. However, today, design issues are often identified proactively and are addressed prior to marketing to prevent some medication errors from ever occurring. So we take the knowledge that we've learned about medication errors in the post-market space and apply it towards new products in the pre-market space. And in the pre-market space, we use data derived from medication error reporting in order to reduce the risk of medication errors occurring post-approval. Next slide, please. So there are two groups within the CDERS, or the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, that focus primarily on medication error prevention, analysis, and mitigation. And these groups are the Division of Medication Error Prevention and Analysis, or DMEPA, and there's a DMEPA 1 and DMEPA 2, as well as the Division of Mitigation Assessment and Medication Error Surveillance, or DMAPS. Next slide, please. So DMEPA is the CDER lead for pre-market medication error prevention and analysis for both drug and therapeutic biological products. DMEPA also reviews weekly surveillance reports and medication errors submitted to the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, or FAERS. And DMAPS is a new division established within OSC and is the CDER lead for post-market medication error pharmacovigilance, including signal management. Additionally, DMAPS focuses on post-market research and innovation. So both DMEPA and DMAIMS are comprised of scientists and healthcare professionals with varied backgrounds, including pharmacists, nurses, and social scientists. And so for this presentation, we will primarily focus on the review work conducted within DMEPA. Next slide, please. So the majority of DMEPA's review work or activities focuses on the pre-market evaluation of proprietary names, non-proprietary name suffixes or suffixes for non-proprietary naming of biological therapeutics, product labeling, which includes the evaluation of proposed container labels, carton labeling, prescribing information, patient information, and instructions for use among other labeling, and the evaluation of product packaging, product design, and human factors. Additionally, as mentioned, DMEPA also conducts post-market surveillance of medication error reports submitted to FAERS, but DMAIMS is the CEDAR lead for post-market medication error pharmacovigilance. So DMEPA reviews take into account current federal regulations, applicable guidances for industry, USP standards, and relevant post-market experience. And so for today's webinar, we will focus on DMEPA's review of product design, labeling, and packaging of drug products. Next slide, please. So the guidance for industry safety considerations for product design to minimize medication errors, which was finalized in 2016, provides a set of principles for using a systems approach to minimize medication errors related to product design and container closure design in order to enhance patient safety. So in this guidance, FDA expects manufacturers to investigate, understand, and correct identified risks using analytical methods in order to develop drug products, build safety into the product design, and apply these methods early in drug development and throughout the drug product's life cycle, and to enable safe and correct use by eliminating or reducing design elements that can cause use-related hazards. Next slide, please. So what is human factors? So there are multiple definitions of human factors that are used throughout the field. And one definition that's adopted by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society defines human factors as the scientific discipline concerned with the understanding of interactions among humans and other elements of a system, and the profession that applies theory, principles, data, and methods to design in order to optimize human well-being and overall system performance. And so in this definition, the system represents the physical, cognitive, and organizational artifacts that people interact with. And human factors engineering is sometimes used interchangeably, or that term is sometimes used interchangeably with usability engineering. Next slide, please. So during the development and design of a drug product's labeling, and packaging, it's important to consider the intended uses, the end users, and their environments of use. And medication error risk assessment should take into account all of the prospective end users and the environments in which the product will be prescribed, dispensed, and used. And these considerations are very important early in the development and design of a drug product. And we recommend that sponsors conduct risk assessments and really incorporate human factors early and throughout the development and design of their drug products to ensure that their product design supports safe and effective use. Next slide, please. So the term user interface refers to all components of a product in which a user interacts with, such as, meaning sees or touches, such as labels, packaging, the container closure system, including controls and displays. And so how a user locates and interprets information necessary to use the product is critical to the product's safe and effective use. And because labeling, packaging, and nomenclature have been identified as key system elements that have great influence on medication use, any weakness or failure in the design of these elements can cause medication errors that can lead to patient harm. So therefore, the goal is to design a drug product that enables safe and correct use and eliminates or reduces design elements which are use-related hazards. Next slide, please. So DMEPA reviews container closure design to determine whether it's appropriate for the intended users and whether it's safe for the route of administration. We've received reports of wrong route of administration errors, which were attributed to the container closure design. So for example, we've received medication error reports of capsules which are intended for inhalation that have been swallowed. We've received reports of topical products that are packaged in container closure systems that look similar to eye, ear, nasal, or oral products, which have been inadvertently applied via the wrong route of administration. We've received reports regarding oral or topical drug products packaged in vials that have been led to intravenous administration. And so for these reasons, it's important to avoid the use of container closure systems that implies a route of administration other than the route that's intended. So these are things that DMEPA looks for when we review product design. Next slide, please. So we also look for consistency between the drug product strength and the product dose. So for example, the typical dose requires the administration of 6 vials. We have seen reports of dosing errors due to miscalculations on the number of vials or forgetting how much has already been administered. Next slide, please. And furthermore, if a product is co-packaged with a delivery device, such as an oral syringe or a syringe that's intended for subcutaneous administration, the units of measurement on the dosing delivery device should be consistent with the recommended dose and needs to be readable. Specifically for oral solutions, the dosing devices should use metric units. And so, for example, when we see those oral dosing cups that are embossed, it's very difficult to read that information. So those are things that we look for when we're evaluating these oral or these delivery devices as well. Next slide, please. So the most effective strategies to minimize medication errors focuses on improving the design of the product user interface. And so DMEPA is involved as early as investigation or new drug application phase in order to provide input to applicants and sponsors on their proposed product design. And so in designing a user interface, companies should consider all end users and all environments of use for the product throughout the entire medication use process to help identify risks that may lead to errors. And we recommend that sponsors evaluate how and why problems have occurred with products that are similar to what they're proposing, and really consider lessons learned in order to prevent those same errors from occurring with their product. Next slide, please. So failure mode and effects analysis, or FMEA, is a type of proactive risk assessment that should be applied early in a drug development program in order to build safety into the product design and throughout a drug product's life cycle. And it's a systematic evaluation of a proposed product within the medication use system, and it considers everyone in the medication use process. FMEA provides an understanding of how the users interact with a product, identifies where errors can occur at each step of use, and assesses the relative impact of different types of system failures that may affect use-related medication error and prioritization of risk. It also identifies mitigation strategies to address the identified risks and evaluates the success of such mitigations at reducing the risk of products to an acceptable level. Next slide, please. And so based on a product's risk analysis, we recommend that companies conduct human factors studies to determine whether users can safely and correctly perform critical tasks associated with the use of a product. And these studies seek to assess actual use of the product and collect data from representative users in a simulated real-world environment. These studies are generally small in size and are considered a relatively small investment of resources early on in a product development, which really can avoid the need for more costly solutions to resolve issues that may occur or may be identified and may occur after the product is approved and on the market. Next slide, please. So we'll shift a little bit to how DMEPA reviews container labels and carton labeling. And so the final guidance for industry safety considerations for container labels and carton labeling to minimize medication errors was published earlier this year in May 2022. And so this guidance focuses on safety aspects of the container label and carton labeling design and provides a set of principles and recommendations for ensuring that critical elements of a product's container label and carton labeling are designed to promote safe dispensing, administration, and use of the product. And as previously stated, it is important that sponsors really consider the intended uses and users and their environments of use during the development and design of the drug products labels and labeling. Next slide, please. And there's some transitions here, Jordan, so would you mind? Yep, there we go, perfect. So when DMEPA reviews the labels and labeling, we ensure that critical product information, which is the proprietary name, the established name or proper name, dosage form, strength, route of administration, and any warnings or cautionary statements, that information should appear prominently on the principal display panel or PDP to maximize readability. And the principal display panel is the panel of the container label or carton labeling that is most likely to be displayed, presented, or shown or examined by the end user. So other information on the PDP, such as the RX only statement and the net quantity of contents, manufacturer name, manufacturer logo, it's important that that information does not compete in size and prominence with the other critical information identified on this slide. Next slide, please. And so for some of the other information, we really encourage companies to utilize side or back panels for non-critical information. And this includes, product strength equivalency statements or lot numbers, expiration dates, recommended dosage statements. And all of this can go on side or back panels in order to be able to maximize the prominence of the most important critical product information on the PDP. Next slide, please. And so additionally, when we review labels and labeling, we look to see, if the font on the labels and labeling is easy to read, it's not lightweight or condensed, and published references recommend a larger font size, such as 12-point sans serif, in order to improve readability. We also evaluate the color contrast between text and the container or carton background color to ensure adequate legibility of the text. And we recommend that companies avoid color combinations that are difficult to read, such as yellow text against a white background, and use something that's a lot more readable. Next slide, please. Additionally, we recommend that companies or sponsors avoid crowding the principal display panel. And so when labels are crowded, it makes important information difficult to read or it's overlooked. So therefore, we ensure that lines of or blocks of text are separated by sufficient white space, and that, again, non-critical information is located either on side or back panels or in the prescribing information. Additionally, as part of our review, we also ensure that non-standardized or unfamiliar abbreviations, symbols, and dose designations are not used on the labels and labeling. So for example, IU, which stands for international units, may be confused as the intravenous route of administration. And so the Institute, our ISMP, has a list of abbreviations that are misunderstood or misinterpreted, and we typically use that type of list to help us when we're reviewing product labels and labeling. We also ensure that text is not superimposed by images or logos in such a way that could lead to the misinterpretation of critical information, or that it decreases the readability of critical information. Next slide, please. And so to ensure that patients receive the correct product, proprietary names and the established or proper names for biologics should be the most prominent information on the label. And so there is a regulation for this. So per the regulation, the established name should be at least half the size of the proprietary name and should include the dosage form. Next slide, please. And in reviewing a product's strength, we want to ensure that the strength is presented in metric units, that the unit of measurement for the product strength is consistent across the prescribing information, as well as any other labeling, including the carton labeling, container label, or instructions for use, if applicable, and that the strength for small volume injection products, when we're talking about that the strength is expressed as a total drug amount per total volume, followed by the quantity per milliliter in parentheses. And then for dry solid injectable products requiring reconstitution, we look to make sure that the strength is expressed as amount per vial. And then when you have fixed combination drug products, We recommend that slashes should be used to separate the strength of each ingredient on the container label and carton labeling to avoid any misinterpretation. Next slide, please. So we also review net quantity statements in relation to the product strength. So, we've seen that product selection errors or dosing errors can occur if the net quantity is mistaken for the product strength, which has led to underdosing or overdosing. And this error generally occurs when the net quantity is presented more prominently on the label than the product strength, or is located close to the product strength where it's misinterpreted. So there's two examples on the slide here. In the first example, Remeron is available in both 15 milligrams and 30 milligram strengths. And so we notice that the net quantity of 30 tablets is very prominent and may be mistaken for the product strength. And when we take into consideration how we generally read labels from top to bottom, we ensure that the product strength is located more centrally, and we would also recommend that the net quantity is less prominent and located away from the product strength. And in the second example on the bottom, we note that the strength is located in the upper right corner next to the net quantity, and it's not very prominent on the label. So in the revised label on the right, you can see that the strength is much more prominent with an increased font size and is relocated away from the net quantity as well. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the route of administration must be on the principal display panel. The route of administration generally should be described without abbreviation. We recommend using positive statements such as for intravenous use, or give by subcutaneous injection. Negative statements such as not for intrathecal use should generally be avoided because it's easy to overlook the word not, even when you are emphasizing it by color, using title case or uppercase, bolding, underlining. We've still received reports that that word has been overlooked. So if a negative statement is unavoidable, it should follow an affirmative statement. And using affirmative statements helps to ensure that end users understand the intended route of administration, even if they don't read every word. Next slide, please. So if there's a product available with multiple strengths, we want to ensure that we highlight the strength in order to ensure adequate differentiation between the strengths. So in the example on the left, you can tell that it's difficult to see the difference between the two products. And so therefore, we recommend incorporating techniques such as boxing and color differentiation in order to ensure that the product strength stands out. And you can see that being implemented on the labels on the right. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, color can be used to differentiate products within a manufacturer's product line. It can be used to differentiate strengths within a product line, or it can be used to highlight important aspects of a label, such as warning statements. Color coding, however, is a bit different because it uses color to designate a specific meaning. And we generally recommend avoiding color coding in most instances, as identifying products by color may discourage reading the labels, which is similar to an example that Matt provided earlier today. Next slide, please. There are specific circumstances in which color coding may be appropriate, such as when certain drug product strengths are universally coded across all manufacturers, as is in the case of warfarin and levothyroxine. But in other cases, color coding can lead to confusion between different drug products and different strengths. And it has its own risks. So one example for where it is, has presented risks is color coding the caps used for ophthalmic products to distinguish a therapeutic class. So although color coding the caps is useful to healthcare providers in that field and some patients in identifying the therapeutic class of medication, it's generally not helpful to end users outside of that field. And in fact, color coding has made it difficult for users to differentiate between drugs within the same therapeutic class when the color code was used on the container label and carton labeling. And because these products are typically stored near each other, the similar appearance of container labels and carton for the wrong dose, the wrong product. And so for these reasons, color coding of ophthalmic products should really be limited only to the cap color and not necessarily applied throughout the labels and labeling. Next slide, please. And when reviewing blister pack presentations, there are definitely some unique design considerations. So for unit dose blister cells, we recommend that the barcode and all other required or critical information appears over each blister cell. So this important information really remains available to the end users up until the point where the last dose is removed. We also recommend that product strength is described as the amount of drug per single unit. So for example, milligram per tablet. However, for products where the blister pack or carton contains one dose and the dose requires more than one unit, such as more than one tablet or capsule, then the principal display panel really should include both the amount of drug per single unit, so milligram per tablet, and the total dose contained in the blister pack or carton, and to avoid any confusion. Next slide, please. In general, we recommend that sponsors really carefully consider the overall design of blister pack labels to prevent confusion and dosing errors, and consider the intended patient population and the dosage and administration when they're designing the packaging configuration. If multiple configurations of a blister pack will be introduced, we recommend that there's adequate differentiation between the configurations to ensure that they can be distinguished and correctly selected throughout the medication use process, all the way from prescribing to dispensing to administration. Next slide, please. So now we'll take a brief look into DMEPA and DMAIM's role in the post-market surveillance of medication errors. Next slide, please. Yep, thank you. So you may be asking, why is post-market surveillance necessary? And, we acknowledge that there are limitations to detecting medication errors during pre-market clinical trials because these trials are conducted under controlled conditions. They may not use the final approved name, the final approved labels and labeling and packaging. And they're often short in duration. They have a small number of patients, and the number of patients may be too small to detect serious but rare problems, and some errors may fall into that category. Although FDA has a robust program to identify potential errors and address them prior to approval, medication errors still remains a significant burden on our public health. So post-market surveillance really allows us to monitor error reports and address the causes of errors that may be related to drug name, labeling, or packaging. Next slide, please. So the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, or FAERS, is FDA's primary source for monitoring medication errors. But we also look at other sources, including ISMP newsletters. So FDA has a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, agreement with the ISMP and other organizations to share publicly available medication error information. Next slide, please. So where do these medication error reports come from? Well, they come from patients, consumers, and healthcare providers. These errors are reported either directly to the FDA MedWatch program, or they're reported to the drug manufacturer, who then sends these reports to the FDA. And DMEPA and DMAIMS then reviews these medication error reports for potential safety signals. We know that the reporting of medication errors is completely voluntary unless the incident is associated with an adverse event. Next slide, please. And so due to the voluntary nature of medication error reporting, we know that medication errors are underreported and that the extent of underreporting is unknown. There's no US requirement currently to report medication errors to the FDA, and so therefore the likelihood of reporting medication errors is lower in comparison to reporting adverse events. Next slide, please. But, I guess, why is that the case? And we recognize that there are barriers for reporting medication errors, such as the fear of punishment or litigation, or organizational culture, or the amount of time that's needed to submit a report, or not knowing how to submit a report, or even just embarrassment about being involved in a medication error. But, as I've stated before, it's so important that healthcare providers submit reports of these medication errors to the FDA, because that's the only way that we're aware of the issue and we can correct the problem. If we don't know anything about it, we can't do anything about it. Next slide, please. And so based on these medication error reports, when we evaluate a safety signal and determine that regulatory action is required, we have many options available to us. And that includes changing labels, labeling, product design, as well as proprietary name. We can also publish drug safety communications and consumer updates. And so in this example on the slide here, we received reports of potential lookalike container and carton labeling between these two products. And we performed our risk assessment, notified the therapeutic review divisions and the manufacturer. We continued to receive reports of near misses where the error was caught before reaching the patient. And the manufacturer planned to revise labels and labeling to differentiate the products. They also distributed a Dear Healthcare Provider letter and distributed stickers to institutions using the products, requesting that the institutions affix the stickers to the vials to help to differentiate the two products during the period when these new carton and container labels were being developed and distributed. But then the FDA received a serious report where the patient actually received the wrong drug. And at that point, we pushed the manufacturer to urgently revise the labels and labeling to get the new product out there with the revised labels and labeling on the shelf and prevent any future errors from occurring. Next slide, please. So in summary, we strongly encourage healthcare providers to report all medication errors to MedWatch. Like I said, if we're aware of the problem, then we can really work to provide effective interventions that may help to prevent further errors. And we can address the errors that are occurring with a specific product, but we can also apply that knowledge, like I said, to the pre-market space and ensure that any products that are coming out onto the market don't encounter those same issues. And so that really helps us to anticipate potential errors, which is then used to help us address these risks related to naming, labeling, and design of a product prior to the product being marketed. Next slide. And these are just some resources of the guidances that I mentioned, as well as the regulations that we review in order, that we take into consideration as we review labels and labeling and product design. And that is it. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Michelle. And Jordan, if there's one more slide after this, Jordan, there we go. So first I want to thank Michelle for her presentation today. And we have probably time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, Michelle, before we go. And there are some questions with common themes. One dealt with investigational drugs. One person's asking, do you think the FDA will be able to focus more attention on safety and appropriate labeling of investigational drugs? And another person also makes reference to how poor the labeling is on investigational drugs. And before Michelle answers, ISNP has written about that a couple of times on our website. If you search for investigational drugs, we wrote a big article in 2018 about the errors associated with them, with our recommendations. But I also know the FDA probably a year ago had a meeting to discuss the labeling of investigational drugs. And Michelle, I don't know if you have anything more to add to that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was actually going to mention. So, the FDA had a public meeting regarding investigational drug labels, container labels, sorry. And this was, I believe in May of 2021. And the purpose of that meeting was really to get input from stakeholders, including sponsors and clinical sites and other places that actually supply these investigational drug labels, to get more information on the risk of medication errors potentially related to the content and the format of these investigational drug container labels, and get a sense of the prevalence and the nature of these errors, and just gather information on practices that would help to minimize the potential for these medication errors. So, we've gathered all that information and we're kind of just processing and taking it back, thanks to everyone's feedback there.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. One more question. We're at the last of the hour, and 2 of them dealt with the COVID vaccine labeling in the packaging, especially the monovalent and bivalence, where there's just seemed to be, I think we've written it too, is about some concerns with when it first came out, the labeling and packaging of the vaccines. And they've changed over time too as well, Michelle. Can you just comment on, especially with the EUA for those vaccines, how that review of the labeling took place and maybe changes that occurred with the vaccines?
Yeah, so thank you for that. So In terms of vaccines, the Center for Biologics Evaluations and Research, or CBER, takes the lead in reviewing labels and labeling. And they're aware of these types of errors. I know ISMP has brought it to our attention, and they're evaluating the risk of medication errors as well, due to these mix-ups.
Great, Vishal, thank you very much. Well, it's 2 o'clock on the hour, so I want to thank everyone again for joining us for today's program and hope to see you sometime soon. I also want to again extend gratitude to Novartis for sponsoring this program today. This now concludes our webinar.